Well, there's some stories or situations, circumstances that we encounter that need some background information in order for it to make sense. One of those that come to mind is Charles Dickens' novel, A Christmas Carol, that, one of the first things you learn is Marley was dead. And that through that, when Ebenezer Scrooge encountered the spirit of Marley, it made sense, as much as that story can make sense, I guess. But it was background information that was important for us to understand the context of the story. And so when we get to the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, when they're building the temple, I think there's some background information that we need to recognize before we get to Ezra chapter 4. Because what happened is when Israel first entered the promised land, and they get there, and God told them to drive out all the people there, and basically to keep themselves pure so they would not be corrupted from other pagans and other religions and get distorted from God. But they didn't. They didn't obey God. They allowed other people to stay and essentially assimilated to those types of beliefs and ideologies, essentially beginning a slow descent away from God, and they got further from God and further from God. They kept compromising and assimilating more and more to the other cultures and other religions. And so they made that mistake. So when we get to Ezra chapter 4, I think we need to keep that in the background of our mind for what they are encountering and what they are trying to guard against. Because they're trying to rebuild the temple. They're trying to build it and restore it. And whenever we have a project at hand or a task that we are trying to accomplish, I think focus is really important. Now, we have many different things that can help us focus. And I have in my possession here a pair of binoculars. Now, these are not real spectacular binoculars. They're just kind of run-of-the-mill, average, you're probably cheap binoculars, however cheap they can be. And growing up, the only time I really ever used these binoculars, or binoculars in general, was when a deer or a turkey would just be hanging out in my back field, right? So I'd get the binoculars out. I could see the animal, but the binoculars allowed me to see them more clearly. And after 2 or 3 minutes, I kind of moved on with life. But we recognize binoculars. You don't walk around with binoculars, right? I can kind of see you, but this is a terrible way to live, a terrible way to function. If I'm not careful, I'm going to step right off the stage, and that would be memorable. But the reality is these have a purpose, and these are specific focus for us. So as we think about what the people of God are trying to do when they're building the temple, I want us to keep in mind of the focus that they did or did not have. Because when we get to chapter 4, we find that Zerubbabel is leading the temple rebuilding process, and they are encountered by their enemies, is what the text says. And so it actually says, so they, the enemies, approached Zerubbabel and the leaders of Israel and said, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God just as you do. We have sacrificed to him ever since King Esarhaddon of Assyria brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the other leaders of Israel replied, "You may have no part in this work. We alone build the temple for the Lord, the God of Israel." So right off the bat, they reject help. They reject assistance. And on some level, this seems a little weird. Well, these people are just being nice. They're being good neighbors. They're trying to lend a hand, relieve some of the burden. Now, they make a false claim here. They say, "We serve the same God you do." That wasn't necessarily true. They may have affirmed Yahweh, this God that Zerubbabel and his people were following. They may have affirmed that Yahweh was a God or one of the deities that may be worthy of worshiping, but they did not affirm him as the one true God. And so their premise of "we worship the same God as you" is lacking. But this was a dangerous attack, because what was at stake here was control and influence. By offering to help, the enemies of God's people were coming and saying, "We're going to help, but when we help, we can influence, we can dictate, we can control, we can have a stake in how the temple functions." So they were wanting control over the temple. Now, this was the first attack of the enemy. And really, this is a pretty subtle attack. Right? If somebody says, "Hey, can I help you?" that doesn't come off as aggressive or abrasive or really anything that's dangerous. It comes off as helpful, it comes off as nice. But this was about compromise, about assimilation, of making sure that they didn't make the same mistakes that they made when God's people first entered the promised land. We must be careful not to compromise, not to assimilate. We also have to remember that in this particular moment, God's people were in a pretty precarious situation. They were in no place to make enemies. They were weak, they were vulnerable, they didn't have much going for them. They needed to make friends. They needed people to like them. They needed support. They needed protection. But I think it's great because in this instance, they recognize they need God more than they need any worldly help. They recognize where they needed to plant their flag, I guess. Now one of the things about war and conflict is we have two sides that are competing with the ideologies. If the two sides agreed, there would be no conflict. I think one of the obvious examples is we can think of World War II. And from growing up and learning in history books, what I find was at stake was fascism versus freedom. And it was basically, are you going to be controlled or can we have freedom? The free world versus the fascism world or the imperialist world. And there was a huge conflict because of that. And obviously that was a poor choice of words. World War II was obviously a huge conflict. But I'm saying that there was a clash there. And the two sides could not coexist together. It was either free or it wasn't. Now, whether that's true or not, I'm not exactly sure. I'm not here to debate that. But we see that there's a conflict. And throughout the course of the war, there are back and forth battles and all those types of things. But when one group conquered another, they planted their flag in that place. Probably the most famous example is Iwo Jima. Right? We have seen the pictures. Some of you maybe have actually seen the memorial of the 5 soldiers putting the flag up. And what a monumentous occasion for that, of showing how the Allied forces are making progress and they are moving forward. You see, if you're going to defeat the enemy, but do the exact same thing the enemy did, there's no point to have the conflict. So what God's people are doing in this moment is saying, there's a difference between you and us. Now, there's no animosity with Zerubbabel and God's people. There's nothing where he's saying, we don't like you. He's saying, we can't compromise. This is where our flag is planted. This is something that is non-negotiable for us. The enemies wanted to distort God's plan, wanted to have control and influence over what God was wanting to do. This does lead me to the question of we have to make sure that, am I like the enemy? When I talk to God, do I want control? Do I want influence? Or am I submitting to him? Am I allowing him to be the controlling power in my life? Or am I trying to let the situation be better for me? Well, in response to that, we pick up in Ezra chapter 4, verse 4, the local residents tried to discourage and frighten the people of Judah to keep them from their work. They actively did things to stop the rebuilding of the temple. They had this first attempt, hey, we want to help you. They had about control, about influence, and then they went to some more explicit approaches. And they had several different things. Then after a while, they kind of got fed up, and so they ended up, I think they kind of tattled on the people of God. They sent a letter to the king, telling the king what was happening. And so in Ezra chapter 4, verse 12, we see they've sent a letter to King Artaxerxes. It said, the king should know that the Jews who came here to Jerusalem from Babylon are rebuilding this rebellious and evil city. They have already laid the foundation and will soon finish its walls. And the king should know that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, it will be much to your disadvantage, for the Jews will then refuse to pay tribute, custom, and tolls to you. Since we are your loyal subjects and do not want to see the king dishonored in this way, we have sent the king this information. We suggest that a search be made in your ancestors' records where you will discover what a rebellious city this has been in the past. In fact, it was destroyed because of its long and troublesome history of revolt against the kings and the countries who controlled it. We declared to the king that if the city is built and its walls are completed, the province west of the Euphrates River will be lost to you. So they made an accusation, a pretty intense accusation, that if you let this city, let Jerusalem, let God's people rebuild the temple, that they're going to start their own kingdom, they're going to disregard you, they're going to do their own thing. And here in this, I think we find something that's common. When opportunity is present, opposition usually is too. That when God gives us an opportunity, there's usually an attack that comes with it. Now, I'm not saying it's equal and opposites. That's not my point. But usually when God gives us an opportunity, there's some type of resistance, something that tries to hold us back, something that tries to distract us, something that gets us off course, whatever that may be. So there was an opportunity here, and the opposition came. And if we're honest, this is typically how the world responds to godly obedience. I would probably say most of the time the world is indifferent to religion. Those who are irreligious really don't care. They don't care what we're doing right now. They're out doing whatever else they want, right? The world is indifferent to us. But when we take a stand for Jesus, when we refuse to compromise, and we courageously live for Jesus, the world notices and says, we don't like that. So the world recognizes that. So in this moment, we see the enemies of God's people are not only actively trying to stop them, but are going out of their way to do all they can to prevent them from completing the temple. So I kind of get this picture of when they first went to offer help. Man, they were cordial. They were nice. They shook everybody's hands. Hey, good to see you. They worked the crowd. But then the smiles started to wear off their face. When God's people said, we're not going to compromise, the smile wore off their face. They rolled up their sleeves and said, we're going to take care of this. That's what the enemies were doing. They were doing all they could to stop this. See, the more opportunity we have, the more opposition we will face. So Artaxerxes receives this, and we pick up the story in Ezra chapter 4, verse 19, and his response to their letter. It says, I ordered a search of the records and have found that Jerusalem has indeed been a hotbed of insurrection against many kings. In fact, rebellion and revolt are normal there. Powerful kings have ruled over Jerusalem and the entire province west of the Euphrates River, receiving tribute, custom, and tolls. Therefore, issue orders to have these men stop their work. That city must not be rebuilt except at my express command. Be diligent and don't neglect this matter, for we must not permit the situation to harm the king's interest. And this isn't true. This is not in the story. But I just get a picture of the enemies of God's people reading this, and then they skip merrily along to go convey this to God's people of saying, you can't do this anymore. We won. We told on you, and the teacher said stop. That's the impression I'm getting. They had to go tell them. But Artaxerxes researched the claims. He did what he was supposed to do. When a claim of insurrection or trouble came to the king, it was important for him to research the credibility of the claims and accusations that were made. And in all reality, they were accurate. What the enemies claimed was true. It was a hotbed of insurrection. Now, the truth was cherry-picked a little bit. The accusations were selected on purpose for those reasons. But when we look at Israel's history, we find that as they began their downward spiral and they lost power as a nation and they lost their focus on God, that they made treaties with Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and any other country they could get in cahoots with. And eventually they broke all of those treaties and all those agreements. So it was true. They had done those things. They had made agreements and they had rejected them. They had gone back on them. And so Artaxerxes sees this and says, this is a troublesome area. We need to make sure that we don't allow this place to flourish and grow and get back to how it was when it created all this trouble. So the construction of the temple stopped. And for about 10 years, it stopped. Nothing happened. The people essentially went home because the enemy had won. The enemy had worked tirelessly to stop their plans, to stop the rebuilding of the temple. Essentially, the enemy was finally able to find the right spin to trap them. And that's what they did. They presented certain truths in a certain way that got a certain outcome. So they spun the situation in their favor. But I want to tell you today, don't fear how the enemy might spin things against you. Because if we get caught up in that, then we're going to lose focus on Jesus. If we get caught up in what the world is talking about, how the accusations they're making, the things they're trying to do to stop us, we're going to take our eyes off Jesus. So instead, we need to make sure we courageously follow Jesus. And when we don't, When we focus on how the world spins things, all we're going to do is get dizzy. It's going to be hard to keep our focus. It's going to be hard to make sure we maintain what Jesus is calling us to do. But fortunately, what God does is he raises up people to proclaim the word of the Lord to get his people back on track. And so he raises up Haggai. And one of the things about the Old Testament is making sure we kind of connect the dots. Because Haggai and Zechariah, or some of the minor prophets, some of those smaller books that you're probably not as familiar with, close to the end of the Old Testament, they were alive and written during this time in Ezra. This time in Ezra chapter 4, 5, and 6. So God raises up Haggai, and in chapter 1, verse 4 of Haggai's book, he writes, "Why are you living in luxurious houses while my house lies in ruins?" That is the word of the Lord. God is asking his people that question. Because essentially what happened is the enemy told on God's people, and Artaxerxes said, hey, we need to stop that work. So they went home. They went home and they decorated their house. They took care of their place. They didn't take care of God's place. They neglected it. Not only did they neglect it, it wasn't finished yet. They said, we got bigger things to do. So they went and focused on themselves. They went and started taking care of their own homes, and that wasn't acceptable. So people like Haggai and Zechariah were risen up, and because of them, because of the word that God had given them, because of the passion that God had given them, because of the message, the people were moved, and they began to rebuild the temple through Haggai and Zechariah. They come and they get people excited again. They get Zerubbabel back on track so he can lead the people to rebuild the temple. Because what they recognize and they get back to is they remember that they are dependent upon God's faithfulness. They're not dependent upon what the king does or doesn't say. They're not dependent upon what the enemy might or might not spin. They're dependent upon God's faithfulness. Because without God's faithfulness, God's people have no hope. If God is not faithful, if we can't trust God, if he's not going to show up, then we have no hope. We have no power. We have no ability. Which brings me to the conclusion that obedient faithfulness conquers political maneuvering every single time. No matter what's happening, obedient faithfulness conquers political maneuvering. No matter how smart you are, no matter how intelligent you are, no matter how many resources you have, no matter how many friends you have, political maneuvering will only get you so far. But the word of the Lord was delivered through Haggai and Zechariah, and it inspired the people to restart the temple. But it did another thing that I think we need to not miss. They affirmed that God ordained the rebuilding of the temple. Amen. Solomon built the temple way back in Kings and Chronicles, and it was destroyed. But here with Haggai and Zechariah, we find that it is rebuilt, and God is commissioning them to do this. But there's still the enemy. The enemy is still present. But there's a new governor, new leader of the area at this time. His name is Tattenai. And he visits Jerusalem and sees the temple being rebuilt, and he's like, oh, what's happening here? So he does what any good leader does, in my opinion, is he goes and he asks questions. Says, who gave you permission to do this? And who's doing the work? And what are all the plans? He asked questions to get information so that he could recognize and figure out what should or should not happen. So the remnant, the God's people that were rebuilding the temple, they just kind of tell him, well, Cyrus told us to. Cyrus gave us the ability, the freedom. He commissioned this work to be done. And I can see the Tattenai's mind working of, well, that's not what these other people are saying. These enemies of God's people are saying something completely different. So he does what he's supposed to do, and he contacts the king, and it's a new king at this point. It's Darius. And so he tells them all what's happening. He's got this conflicting information. Got the enemy of God's people are saying one thing, God's people are saying another. And so he sends information to Darius, and Darius looks things up. And in this, Darius, he sends his response, but in his response, he finds what Cyrus had written. And here's what Cyrus had written. It says, let the temple be rebuilt on the site where the Jews used to offer their sacrifices using the original foundations. Its height will be 90 feet, and its width will be 90 feet. Every 3 layers of specially prepared stone will be topped by a layer of timber. All expenses will be paid by the royal treasury. Furthermore, the gold and silver cups, which were taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar from the temple of God in Jerusalem, must be returned to Jerusalem and put back where they belong. Let them be taken back to the temple of God. So that's what Cyrus wrote, what he decreed. And so then Darius responds, and he's writing to the enemies of God's people. He says, stay away from there. Do not disturb the construction of the temple of God. Let it be built on its original site, and do not hinder the governor of Judah and the elders of the Jews in their work. Moreover, I hereby decree that you are to help those elders of the Jews that they rebuild this temple of God. You must pay the full construction costs without delay from my taxes collected in the province west of the Euphrates River, so that the work will not be interrupted. So the response is back, and Tatnai, he sent this letter. He was unsure how to proceed, so he inquired of the king and tried to get information from that, because God's people and the enemy had a different account. But not only did Darius find that Cyrus actually commissioned this, he actually found that funds were promised to support the work that was happening here. That funds were promised to help the temple to be rebuilt. I think that's pretty crazy to me. Because when we think about it, when we look at the story as a whole, the only thing that the enemy was successful at doing was getting the project funded. They told him the project got delayed a little bit, don't get me wrong, but really, eventually it came back to Darius and said, hey, we said we're going to pay for this. So start paying. Empty your pockets out. Don't let this be neglected. Do this immediately. But that's how our God works. We've got opportunity and we've got opposition. And you know what? God can spin that opposition for our advantage. That's what happened here. That when God's people got out of their own head, when they got their focus back on track, and they said, God has commissioned this. God has called us to do this. In fact, the king said we can do this. We're doing nothing wrong, and it's ordained by God, so we're going to keep doing this. They didn't try to manipulate the situation. They didn't try to maneuver, do any political type stuff. They said, this is what Cyrus said we could do. God has told us to do this. And they just went about their business. But too many times we get distracted by other things and we lose focus. But in this, when I consider the fact that the enemy's only success was getting it funded, it reiterates the fact in my mind that obedient faithfulness conquers political maneuvering every single time. But it's about focus. It's about making sure we're looking at the correct things. And so I had some binoculars that I showed here. And got another thing here. Got a magnifying glass, right? Now, this is really not going to do me any good. Not that the binoculars did me any good here this morning when I couldn't see, but I can. Right? It's blurry. I mean, I can kind of look at my tablet here. Some of you might find that beneficial, actually. But the reality is this allows for certain things to focus on. We can, make font bigger. We can examine documents, or hopefully you're not burning ants, I guess, but that's not the point of it. But the reality is there's a specific type of focus that this will help us with. Help us to be able to see things more clearly when we use it the right way. And so when we focus correctly on Jesus, it will enhance us. It will give us clarity. It will give us direction to make sure that we are moving in the correct direction. But then we get to chapter 6, in fact, the last half of chapter 6, and we find that the temple is rebuilt, and it's a joyous celebration. Not only that, they celebrate the Passover. But when we consider all that's happened in the first 6 chapters of Ezra, when the temple was rebuilt, it was a joyous occasion. People celebrated. But in Ezra chapter 3, the foundation of the temple was laid. And if you remember that, there were some people that were celebrating, there were some that were mourning and weeping. And they were weeping because they recognized that the second temple was going to be a shell of what the first temple was. When the first temple was dedicated, we find that King Solomon, he sacrificed 142,000 sheep and cattle. And then there were other sacrifices that couldn't even be counted because they were so numerous. You know how many sacrifices were sacrificed here in Ezra chapter 6? 712. That's a big difference. So we think about the first temple and the second temple, but probably one of the biggest differences outside of size is the fact that the Ark of the Covenant was no longer present. The Ark of the Covenant was a big deal in the Old Testament. I mean, it represented God's presence with Israel as they traveled the desert, and it resided in the temple, but no longer was it there. But even though the Ark of the Covenant wasn't present, even though the temple was much smaller and less grandiose, even though there were less sacrifices, God's presence was still there. And it was still a time of rejoicing, still a time of celebration, a time where God's people recognized God's faithfulness, and because of that, it was good. And because their focus was on God, because their heart was where it needed to be, those 712 sacrifices were just as good as the 142,000 sacrifices. It's not about the amount, it's about the heart, it's about the focus. Because the temple was rebuilt, it was finished. Now it took over 20 years for the temple to be rebuilt because of different delays and all those types of things. But God's people always faced opposition along the way. But that's nothing new. We face opposition all the time. All right? It's not as though opposition is just this newfangled thing or it's an outdated thing that doesn't exist anymore. Opposition always has existed, and I believe it always will exist. But then we can come to Matthew chapter 16, and I think we can get great hope from that verse, from that chapter. Because in this chapter, Peter has confessed that Jesus is the Messiah. And Jesus responds, "Blessed are you, Peter." He says, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not be able to overcome it." Amen. You know, that is a verse that we must allow to sink into our hearts, because no matter the opposition, Jesus has said the gates of hell cannot overcome the work of God's people. Right. Whatever it is, if we have the right focus. You know, if we take our eyes off Jesus, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. But if we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, if we keep focused on Him, then the gates of hell will not be able to overcome it. And then after they dedicated the temple, they celebrated the Passover celebration. The biggest festival for the Jews, a time where they recognized how God delivered them from Egypt, freed them from slavery, led them in the desert, and provided for them all that time. Just a huge moment for them. And particularly for this remnant, these people that had come out of exile. This was like the second Exodus for them, of coming back to the promised land, coming back to Jerusalem, for where God's people were supposed to dwell, and a way of them saying, you know, God is still faithful. We've faced all these trials. We've done all of these things, but God is still faithful. And one of the things that it recognizes to me is that God always provides a way for His people to return. He always finds a way for His people to be redeemed, to be restored, to be made holy, as long as we keep our eyes fixed on Him, as long as we have the right focus. Now, some of you may not know this, but I have prescription glasses and contacts. I don't know if anybody in this church besides my family have ever seen me wear glasses before, because I don't wear them very often. My prescription is actually -1, so any of you who have poor eyesight, you're probably jealous of that. But so really, I don't have contacts in right now, and I can see just fine. I only wear my contacts or glasses sometimes if I'm playing like baseball or driving a long distance that I'm unfamiliar with. But so reality is I don't wear them very often. But when I put them on, I can see you more clearly than when I take them off. Now, I can see you just fine. I can recognize you. I can see colors and everything. But I can see just a little bit more clearly like this. And I think what Jesus wants us to do is he is trying to give us more clarity in our lives. He's wanting us to live with more focus, but with that comes clarity. But I think too many times we're looking for clarity from this. You know, the only thing I really the implication of a magnifying glass is you're looking for clues at a crime scene, right? And I think there are a lot of followers of Jesus that are looking for clues at a crime scene, and that's how they're living life. of they're only looking at the things that are really right in front of us, so they're missing other things. They're missing these opportunities. They're focusing on these things that really don't make much of a difference. I also think there are some people that are living life with the binoculars on. They only want to see the things off far in the distance, the things that maybe have some impact or maybe will in the future, but really don't have much of an impact now. And so they're walking around like this. And you can stumble pretty easily when you walk around like this. And hey, maybe I can see your cell phone if I look at it like this. But the reality, and as I was thinking about that particular concept, maybe pastors fall into this temptation a lot of times of, we can talk about a lot of theological nitty-gritty type stuff. And that stuff's important. I'm not trying to get around that, but we miss the practical application. We can talk about all these grand schemes and concepts. Let's talk about life. And I think Jesus says, you focus on life. Let's give clarity to what you're doing and how you're doing it. Don't worry about what's way over there. Don't worry about what's so small that's not going to make any difference. Just worry about what's in front of you. Focus on the clarity with that. And when we do, I think then we begin to lean in to the faithful obedience that conquers political maneuvering. Because these aren't going to save me. These aren't going to give me much help. There's times where these are beneficial. There are times where these are extremely helpful, but 99.9% of life they're not. There's times when this is extremely helpful. There's times where this can really aid in life, but most of the time it doesn't. Almost all of the time these do. Even if I don't wear them. And I think there are some times we just don't wear them because we don't want to. But I think Jesus calls us to wear them all the time. Because he wants to give us clarity. He wants to give us focus so that we can live in this realm of faithful obedience. So we can see what the enemy is trying to do and say, they're just trying to spin it. They're trying to distract me. They're trying to get my focus off Jesus, but I've got my eyes so firmly fixed upon him that nothing can take it off. Amen. We don't always live that way. It's hard. Sometimes we get distracted, and I'm not trying to be condemning, but when we do, it's important that we come back to Jesus. And we hear the word of the Lord. Because God speaks. He talks to us. He reveals himself to us. God's people in Ezra chapter 4, 5, and 6 heard it from Haggai and Zechariah. And I'm not trying to be arrogant here to saying that I've delivered the word of the Lord in the same way as them, but I believe that the word of the Lord can speak through whatever's happened here this morning. That God can speak to us. So maybe you need to get back on track. Maybe you need to get refocused, whatever that looks like.